Connaissance, recherche,
sciences,
mathématiques,
théorie,
physique, philosophie,
conférences, archéologie, nature.
So I'm going to talk today about a project that we did in Uttar Pradesh in India, which you've already heard a little bit about the state of Uttar Pradesh in other presentations. This work is joint with Esther and Abhijit, Stuti Kamani from the World Bank, and also joint with Rukmini. And I think this was very much a collaboration from the beginning when we were discussing what were the important questions to evaluate, what were the questions that Pratham wanted to know, but also in our early discussions very much questions about what education policy and more generally this whole move to promote participation and beneficiary control, whether it was working, how it could be made to work more effectively, and how Pratham could bring it into their work. So it was a collaboration all the way. So, as I say, there's been an enormous amount of policy focus on the concept of participation, of trying to bring the beneficiaries, the people who benefit from a program, into the process of delivery, monitoring quality, and trying to give them power. We heard Jakob talk yesterday about his talk was called Power to the People, and again was about this idea of giving control, giving more control to poor people on the ground and seeing if we can improve the quality of programs. So why has there been such a big policy focus on this? I think the main starting point is that the quality of services for most poor people in many developing countries is abysmal. The doctors and teachers, nurses often don't show up for work. There's been a lot of work showing that even when medical staff turn up to work, they have very short conversations with their patients. They're very dismissive of them. In education, a survey in India which found very high absenteeism rates for teachers also found that even if they did show up to school, often they were sitting in the staff room talking to other teachers rather than teaching. And so the quality is poor. The delivery system seems often to be more designed around the needs and benefits of those providing it than the people who are benefiting from it. You know, coming from the UK and remembering some of the arguments about public services in the 1970s, I think again there people talked a lot about the fact that we seem to be delivering services. We seem to care more about the public sector workers than about the people who are actually meant to be benefiting from the program. So this is not just a question of developing countries, it's also an issue for developed countries. But it's beneficiaries, it's the people on the ground, the poor people, who are those who suffer from this poor service. So the argument is, they're the people who suffer, they have the information, or they're the ones experiencing the poor quality service. If only we can make them in control, then that is the way to better quality service. So this is the idea behind this big policy push. But there's actually very little evidence about whether this is an effective strategy. So it makes sense in theory, you can argue for it, but does it work on the ground? And the evidence today is limited and mixed. So you heard Yesterday, the first of the studies that I list here, Bjorkman and Svensson with community monitoring and community participation in Uganda, and that was extremely effective in improving nurses showing up, the amount of effort that nurses put in, and ultimately on the rates of care provided, the number of immunizations, really one of the most effective improvements we've seen of any of these studies in healthcare. Another project by Ben Olkin, who we'd hoped might have been at this conference, but unfortunately was unable to come, on community monitoring in Indonesia was much less effective. This was trying to get local people to monitor and reduce corruption on roads in Indonesia, small road projects that were funded by the local community. And he compared bringing in external auditors in Indonesia, who are renowned for being extremely corrupt, versus the local people who would actually benefit from the road. And a lot of people's expectation was that the local people who would benefit from the road would therefore would be better monitors. And in fact, in the overall sample, he found that external monitors were more effective at reducing corruption. There was a project looking at introducing school committees in Kenya to try and oversee education in Kenya. Again, not very effective, although a different version where you actually provided communities with the money and the power to hire extra teachers. Then the teachers were responsible and could be fired by the local committees. That did prove to be very effective. So you can see we're seeing some things work and some things not work. And we're left with a certain amount of confusion about what is the right, when does this work, when does it not work? And often the way in which people talk about empowering people on the ground to monitor services, to improve services, empower the poor to make services accountable is providing information. So there's another whole literature which talks about and evaluates the effect of providing information to people, and does that help them to act? And a number of those have been very effective. Two different studies, one in Madagascar and one in the Dominican Republic, providing information to parents and school children about the returns to staying in school, led to increases in the rate at which children stayed on in school. Pascaline Dupart, who is about to talk after us, has another project looking at providing information to students in school about the relative HIV prevalence of different age groups. Again, led to very big changes in people's behavior. Now, interestingly, those were all cases where you provide someone a piece of information and they can act directly on that information. They don't have to go through the government system. They don't have to rely on everybody else responding. They have the power to act themselves. And this is a theme that I'm going to return to in this talk. But let's step back for a minute and ask, what is participation? Because there are all these buzzwords in the policy community about participation and beneficiary control, and it can mean all sorts of things to different people. So if we're going to evaluate it, we have to be really careful in saying, what is it that we mean? What is it that we're going to try? And as we see, we have different effects. So let's be careful about which one we're testing and which ones work. So the first, or one of these, is accountability through information. So simply providing people with the information about the quality of services. And Jakob yesterday talked about how they provided information about quality, and they felt that was a very important way of empowering people. But that's only one way of improving things. The other very, very common approach is to have some kind of committee made up of local people from the population that's given some kind of oversight role, and the oversight can range in the amount of power that's given to that committee. But this is now almost standard in many donor agencies' programs and a lot of governments to have these committees. And this was something we were very interested in because it has become such a kind of standard part of development practice, and really we have very little information about whether these committees work. So if you remember in Jakob's talk, there were these health management committees at the local level made up of local people who had some oversight role. But they didn't actually have the ability to fire or hire people, so exactly what control they have is often very open to question. There's direct ability to hire people, and that, as we found in the project by Pascaline, Esther, and Michael Creamer in Kenya, was very effective in Kenya. And there's also just the ability to vote with your feet. Just say, if you have a choice of services, that is also a beneficiary power, and the ability to say, I don't like this school, I want to go to another school, and have the money follow you, is a very different alternative approach to participation and local accountability. So what we decided to do was to test some of the most popular of these approaches. One is providing information, and also these local committees, and trying to empower and make them more effective. But we also compared it with an approach which had much more ability for direct action without having to go through the local government services. And Rukmini will talk more in her talk about exactly how that worked and the opportunity that Pratham was able to give them, give local people to respond to the information, give them a way to respond to the information. Uttar Pradesh, as you've heard, is one of the largest states in India, 165 million people in the north, but also one with a very poor education outcome, so one of the 5th poorest literacy rates in India. And this was backed up by the findings in our baseline survey, and this information comes from a very interesting tool, measurement tool that Pratham has developed, and now we use in many of our studies, drawing on their experience. And it just really concentrates on the very basic issues of literacy. Can you read? Can a child recognize letters? You can test a child for these things very quickly, and people who don't have a lot of training can do this kind of testing. So, 13% of these 17 to 14-year-olds could not even recognize a letter, despite the fact that the vast majority of them were in school and in school regularly. So they're going through many years of education and still couldn't recognize a letter. And, only 65% could read words or paragraphs, and 42% could read stories. We have data for the math side as well, but I won't go into that. And an interesting point is that beneficiary control was already in place in theory in these communities. So there were these things called village education committees, which were meant to contain the pradhan, who's the locally elected head of the village overall, the principal of the school, the head teacher of the school, and 3 parents. And they actually had a reasonable amount of power. They couldn't fire the government teacher, but in India you have a certain amount of money that is delegated to each village to spend on education, and they had control over that money. They also had a role in selecting and overseeing Shiksha Mitras, which are the local para-teachers often, so someone not quite so qualified, someone not paid as well as a government teacher, something you find in a lot of developing countries, sort of assistant teachers who come from the local community and can be very effective. And these village education committees were empowered to request if the class size was over a certain amount, and very often the class sizes were enormous in this environment, to ask for these additional teachers, be able to help selecting them and overseeing them, although they did not directly pay them. Now, that was it there in theory. And for the most part, they were constituted, but they were not very active, to say the least. Very few of them knew what their roles were, and in fact, we found quite a lot of them, of members of VECs who did not even know that there was a VEC or that they were a member of the VEC. So only 8% of the population knew that there was a committee on education, and very few of this committee knew that they had this role in hiring Shiksha Mitras. The other thing we found was that parents, teachers and VECs overestimated the amount of learning that was going on in these communities. So parents of children who could not even recognize a letter, 27% of those people thought their children could read stories. I.e., they can't even recognize a single letter, but they think that their child can read a story. And that, a lot of these parents are illiterate themselves. So now I'm going to describe the different approaches that we tested in this experiment. They all started with a similar basis, which is going in to mobilize the community and provide information to them. So Pratham's teams went in and generated discussions, small discussions about learning in hamlets, the small groups of houses that make up villages in India. They had an approach which was to ask questions rather than give answers. So encourage discussion within the community and sort of empower discussion rather than come in as an external person and tell you what's happening. These discussions culminated in a large community meeting on learning and the mechanisms for improving learning. Interestingly, in many of these discussions, it kept moving to money and the grants that poor people are given if their children attend school, rather than, and the Pratham people kept trying to pull it back to, let's concentrate on whether our children are learning when they're in school. And it was deliberately designed so that the Pradhans and the principals answered the questions rather than the Pratham people. But if there were gaps in knowledge or gaps in what was explained to people, then the Pratham workers would come in and fill those gaps. In addition, VECs were given information on their roles and responsibilities. Communities were encouraged to take action to improve learning, with examples, discussion about what can we do. Overall, Pratham staff were in a village for 2 days plus, and they also came up for follow-up visits. If this sounds a little bit familiar, you might recognize that it's kind of a very similar approach to the one that Jakob described yesterday in the health project, although we'll see it has very, very different results. And it was the whole approach was designed to follow best practice guidelines on participation drawn up by the World Bank, being inclusive, realistic, building on existing institutions. The second and third treatments, or as I say, all built on the first, so amongst 280 communities who were involved in this, some were randomized to get treatment 1, some to get treatment 2, some to get treatment 3, and some were control. Treatment 2 really empowered communities to be able to monitor, so they were taught how to test children themselves and develop report cards so that they were presenting at the meeting how much children knew. And I mean, being involved in some of these pilots, you saw a tremendous amount of energy and stress come out when people realized that their children were not learning, but you've been going to school and you still can't recognize the letters. And this made us very optimistic that this would have an impact. Treatment 3 was, again, added on to 1 and 2. In some communities, they were also given the chance to, local volunteers were trained, given the opportunity to be trained by Pratham, to actually teach children. So take direct action in response to the problem. Your children have been going to school for ages, they can't read. We will train you how to run classes in the community to teach children to read. And I think one of the very impressive things about Pratham is the development of tools that have made teaching reading something that untrained volunteers can quickly learn and be very effective at. And I hope Rukmini will talk to you a little bit more about their approach there. So I just want to talk about how we think that participation could change outcomes. There are basically a number of steps that you have to take. You can provide information. Information has to translate into knowledge. You have to absorb that. With the knowledge, you have to decide to take action, and with action, has to actually influence outcomes. And sort of two question marks in there is, for knowledge to lead to action, you have to have a preference, you have to want to take the action, and action can only translate into an outcome if you have the power to make things change. So to go through sort of what the process for in treatment one is, we're providing information on the quality of learning. We want that to translate into knowledge of the quality of services and learning. We want that to translate into knowledge. We want that to translate into action, to take some collective action to improve schools. That action has to then lead to schools improving, and that has to lead to learning. So it's a complicated channel. There's also opportunity, though, for people to have this information and knowledge and take individual action. For example, pull their children out of public schools and send them to private schools, of which there are many in these communities, even when they're poor communities. We're also providing, there also may be knowledge about the level of learning, which again can lead to collective action or individual action. But it can also lead to direct action on learning, so parents could make children, do their homework, encourage them to go to school more often, which could have a direct effect on learning. So treatment one also provides information about the levers of power, about how you can influence outcomes. You have the ability to hire Shiksha Mitras. You have this VEC, you should use it. Treatment two is really about information about how to monitor learning outcomes, which can again lead to more knowledge about learning outcomes, which can lead to action. And treatment three is about information about tools that allow you to act directly. You then have to master the teaching tool, but then you can take direct action on learning. So these are the econometric results. We have an awful lot of variables in each of these, so we group them into different, all the questions we asked about VE knowledge, all the questions we asked about VE activism. The main thing to take away from this is there were very few stars. There's very little effect going on. Let me just summarize it in words. There was some improvement in knowledge. More people knew about VECs. There was kind of weak improvement in knowledge about learning levels. It's actually quite surprising how little we were able to move, or Pratham was able to move, knowledge in these communities. But there's some. There's definitely more knowledge about the mechanisms. There was no reasonably precisely estimated no impact on collective action. No more discussion of education in village meetings, VECs took no more action, the parents were no more involved in schools. There was also, surprisingly, for treatment 1 and 2, no individual action. People did not move their children out of private schools and into out of public schools and into private schools. In fact, in some cases, there was more dropout from school. Maybe they just decided to give up on the whole system because they realized it was such a disaster. There was no improvement in school quality, no improvement in teachers' presence, no improvement in their teaching, and there was no improvement in learning, unsurprisingly, given that all our other steps to the final outcome have not happened. Now, if we look at treatment 3, did people take Pratham up on this offer to volunteer to teach children to read? And the answer is an overwhelmingly yes. So if we talked about preferences, there was a motivation in these communities to take action. There were people who cared about education in these villages, because when offered the chance to volunteer to teach 1 to 2 hours of classes every day for 2 to 3 months without being paid. This is the number of classes that are held. So 11 communities had no classes, but the most common had 6 classes in a village, so 6 different people volunteering and holding 6 classes every day for 2 to 3 months. Not 6 classes overall, 6 sequences of classes every day for 2 to 3 months, and even some communities where there were 16 classes being held in these villages. And the result is that there was an improvement in learning in these communities. So very little learning had been happening through the schools, but in 2 to 3 months you saw some really quite impressive improvements in learning. What I have on the top table is the average effect for the whole community. So not everyone went to the classes, and you'll see in the bottom, about 8% of the students that we test went to classes. But even so, even though only 8% of students on average were going to these classes, we see an effect when we just look at average learning across the whole community. So 2% more could read letters, and 2% more could read words or paragraphs. Now, that may not seem very much, but first of all, I think it's important to distinguish this into where the kids started off, and also to take into account, as I say, that not everybody was going to these classes. So as I say, averaged over the entire period, the entire village, you've got just less than 2% can read letters and can read words. Basically, when we break this down, we find two things going on. The children who couldn't even recognize a letter when they started, a lot of them were bumped up to being able to read letters. Of those who could read letters at the beginning, you saw big improvements in moving really all the way up the reading scale. And the second and third points show you, again, the average across the whole community. So 8% more likely to read at least a letter if you started off not being able to read a letter, but that's kind of where it stops. Those who could read letters, 3.5% more likely to read paragraphs and words, 3.3% more likely to read stories. Now we want to adjust for the fact that this is coming from only 8% of children. So you heard Bruno talk about, you kind of need to scale up the effect to take into, imagine if all of the improvement was coming just from that 8% who were attending the classes. We scale up that effect. And that, basically, we can tell from that those who read nothing at the start were 60% more likely to recognize letters, and those who read only letters were 26% more likely to read stories. Those at the word paragraph level were 46% more likely to read stories. Indeed, there's not really much scope for the impacts to have been any larger than we see, because children over the year are learning something in school, improving a little bit. If you add what even the controller learning to the additional effect of Pratham being in the village, we end up with every child who could not read a letter at the start could by the end of a read class. And almost every child who could read words at the beginning could read stories by the end of the read class. So this is really a very dramatic impact. I.e., these volunteers with a week's training were delivering results which government teachers had not delivered in many years in the school system. So going back to our kind of mapping of what's going on, we get somewhat weak moving in treatments 1 and 2, we get somewhat weak improvements in knowledge and nothing from knowledge to action. But in the bottom, we get it going all the way through. We see action being taken by the volunteers, we see action being taken by the children to turn up to these classes, and action being taken by parents to encourage them to come, although it's only 8% of the population, and that is what kind of Pratham has been working on to think about how to improve that. So in conclusion, I want to start off by saying, why is it that we get such radically different results from what the Uganda study found? Obviously, it's a different country, it's a different sector, but as they say, the intervention itself was very similar, and yet we're having very, very dramatic results. You know, is it that people don't care about education, they care about health, they don't care about education? Is it that government is more responsive in Uganda than in India? These are things that it's very hard to tell. You know, the Uganda clinics were at a higher level, and therefore some of the members of the committee were much more senior in kind of social status than the poor people in these communities in India, where a lot of the rich are already in private schools. It's also the case that in Uganda they provided people with suggestions for direct action, and in treatments 1 and 2 in India they did not. That could be an effect. But I want to focus on the similarity, because there's a very important similarity that you may lose if you look at the effect of the treatments, which is what the case was at the baseline. In both countries, there was on paper a government system of beneficiary control at the beginning, which was not really working. And so when we think of the policy and conclusions, I think it's very important to remember that, you know, if people say, well, participation works from the Uganda study, let's have a committee, there already was a committee in Uganda, and it was only with intense effort that they were able to make that committee effective. In both India and Uganda, there were these committees of the poor that really were not functioning. So I think we conclude by saying that promoting effective participation is hard, and collective action, getting all the people in a community to work together to produce something, is actually a very hard thing to do. And what works and what doesn't really depends on the details, and we don't know enough about what are the details that make something work and what it doesn't in this area. The standard beneficiary control idea of having these committees, I'm not very enthusiastic about at the end of this, not least just from the baseline results, that in both Uganda and India, these were not really functioning very well at the beginning. And you know, it needed intensive action in Uganda to make these work. And in India, with intensive action, they still didn't work. And I should add here, you know, you can say, well, Pratham maybe not be very good at doing this, but everything else that we've evaluated that Pratham has done has been spectacularly effective. If they can't make these things work, I don't think there's anybody else who can make them work, at least in that level of intensity. I mean, this is an NGO that is fantastically effective, as you see from the volunteer effects, and even they were really struggling to have any impact here. Giving individuals a direct channel for action is, in my mind, a much more promising approach. So now I'd like to hand over to Rukmini and just say that it's been a real inspiration working with Pratham and with Rukmini for these years, both in the effectiveness of what they do in India, but also their openness to being evaluated, having some of their flagship products, you know, have MIT evaluators crawl all over them and be open to the world about whether or not they work. Thanks.
So my first request is that Rachel needs to return to India. She's being sent to all sorts of other parts of the world, but we need her back. Esther already introduced Pratham by saying that she can't even remember how long it's been that we've been working together. So this has been a long relationship, over 10 years, almost 10 years, 4 projects, and if you think of these as sort of a relationship producing children, the pregnancies have been long. I checked yesterday to see what is a pregnancy that goes at least 2 years, and apparently elephants are pregnant for at least 2 years. So we've produced 4 elephants. Hopefully they're not white, and it's been a long innings, and I think it's been very productive. What I want to do is to sort of set the stage within which all of these projects have been evolving. kind of to link with what the opening remarks in this conference were, to say, this knowledge against poverty isn't something that's a one-shot deal. I think things have to evolve over a period of time, and on all sides we have to continuously learn about what could be tried next. And I think to some extent our journey with JPAL has been exactly that, and there's still a lot to learn. So I'm going to share with you what we've done so far, and with bits of what we've learned from the collaborations. So if you just set the stage, Rachel gave quite a few insights. Every child in school and learning well, if that's the objective, then to a large extent, whether every child is in school or not is quite visible. Physically, you can see in a village or in a city whether children are in school. And while the process of getting children into school might be difficult, what is to be done is fairly well understood. On the learning well side, number one, it's much less visible. And next, what to do to fix it is also not as easy. At the ground level, and again coming from some of the things that Rachel said, we sometimes wonder how well we understand our own children. It's a big country, we have a lot of children, we have a lot of big families, our schools have big classrooms, and really when you look at what do the adults know about children, there are some big questions. In the JPAL evaluation, we see that parents send their children to school. In village meeting after village meeting, parents are concerned about inputs, about scholarships, about lunch in school, about teacher absenteeism, but very little natural conversation about what their children learn in school. And when we actually estimated, we find that parents vastly overestimating what their children know. And this is the first step. We don't even need to talk about government's input orientation. This is the parents and the children. In a different study that we've done, we looked at what teachers think that their children know. And there too, we find evidence of teachers vastly overestimating what their children know. Our schools in India, our government schools, are not structured to identify or to pinpoint or to take action on children who are falling behind. And as a result, we see that this invisible problem is probably getting bigger as more and more children come into school, and is there is very few attempts to diagnose it. And if you can't assess it, if you can't understand it, it's very hard to take action on it. A big point that we've learned in our work in the last 15 years, that if you don't learn at the right stage, because there is nobody to identify the problem, because there is no help available either in school or outside, you are going to fall behind and eventually fall out. And therefore, if you miss the boat, even in first or second grade, you're really not going to make it all the way. And therefore, this learning business, we feel, has to be taken extremely seriously. Moving away from the ground, if you go to the high-level policy positions, I'm still kind of puzzled as to who makes policy. Who are these policy makers we're addressing? I hope there are some in the audience here. Because it's kind of, whenever you actually pinpoint people, the policy seems to be made at some other level, not at the person who you're talking to. So if you look at, on the every child in school part, the MDG goals refer to universal enrollment. Our own national goals refer to enrollment, to retention, to reduction of all kinds of gaps that we have. And in India, whether it's in a school, in a village, or in the city, there is continuous effort to measure and to assess how many children are still left out. This has been a big, big preoccupation at government as well as at all levels. If you go to the learning well side, the MDG goals make no mention of it. And perhaps the assumption is that if you're going to school, you'll get the outcome that you want, even though there's very little evidence for that. Our own national goals define learning in the following way, as you see: education of satisfactory quality relevant for life, and more or less, apart from of and for, you could have huge arguments about what all those other words stand for. It's a very vague articulation of what is a national goal, and therefore it's very difficult to actually meet it. We do have some government-based assessments of learning, but these come out some years, 3 or 4 years, and they are not at a level at which planning or allocation is made. So as you can see, the challenge is both at the ground level as well as at the higher macro level. And if we want to really progress, and if we take this MDG goal about universal going to school business seriously, then both for progress as well as for equity, this is a really important issue. So our challenge over the last 10, 12 years is how to bring this learning to the center of the stage in the community, in the village, as well as nationally. What kind of evidence do we need? What kind of evidence convinces people to action? And finally, what kind of action do we need? And in the time that I have, I want to just give you a little bit of flavor of what has been tried on each of these. Very briefly about Pratham, we started in '94. Our mission you can already see, but there's a very strong belief right from the beginning that as citizens, we have to help to supplement and strengthen government efforts. So much of what we've done has really been to strengthen communities to access services and within the schools, build capacity to deliver those services. We, for just various reasons, believe in having simple activities that you can do and low-cost models and techniques, mainly because then you can have large-scale participation of ordinary people. There's been a lot of rapid scaling up, and right now, as of the last year, we work in over 40 cities in India. India has 600 districts, and we have a presence in over half those districts. And it's very hard to calculate this number, but people often, especially donor agencies, want to know, so how many children have you touched? And based on whatever calculations we make, we think the number is something like 30 million children. But there could be debates about whether it's 35 or 25, but it's a large number of children that we feel have been impacted in some way. So from the beginning of our work, initially we worked only in Bombay. And at that point, I started with Pratham in '96. I felt Bombay was a huge place. And our goal was every child in school and learning well in Bombay, which seemed like a ridiculously ambitious, bold task. And somehow we've come a long way, and now we think India is what we should be trying. And the worries are all the same. It's, oh my God, this is really huge. How are we going to do it? And wherever you work, you can see big gaps. You can see that there are many needs. There are preschool needs. There are needs for putting children in school. What about science? What about, there are lots of things. And you never have enough resources to deal with all of them. And therefore, I think from the initial stages of Pratham, we've been very concerned about what can we do. There may be many needs, but what can we do which actually enables us to the best our capacity to deliver that. This curiosity, both within the organization, I think made us very conducive when Esther and Abhijit first came to us. It was something around 99, 2000, that it seemed like the more people that are engaged in the effort of figuring out what makes a difference, the better it will be. And between our own efforts and collaborative projects, I think we've learned a lot. And I've kind of tried to list the key learnings. What kind of tools, whether it is for assessment or for action and methods, are actually doable? There are things that you can do very nicely if you're working with like 500 children. But if you're working with 500,000 children, what would actually work? How do you go the scaled up lead? What do our volunteers or what do ordinary people relate to? Because if you want to move such a huge mass of people to action, there have to be things that actually people can relate to. What about teachers? What about parents? And finally, what kinds of evidence and what kind of action would go together? So I'm going to give you a few examples. Obviously, in this whole period, a lot of things have been tried. And obviously, I'm going to present you things that I think worked. You can ask me in the questions what didn't work. But I don't want to waste my precious time here telling you what didn't work. Actually, there are not that many that didn't work, I think. As an organization, we were very frustrated in our own action at being able to move children up the learning ladder. So if there was a child who is 10 years old, who had never been to school, who comes to a Pratham program, and if we spend a year or two bringing him or her up to kind of a first grade level, that's great, but that's not very useful. Because to really give that child a fighting chance to really enter into the mainstream of elementary education, I need to bring that child up to 5th grade as quickly as possible. So our own internal frustrations about our own ability to propel large numbers of children higher and higher up the learning scale led around 2000, 2001 to big experiments with what would work. And this is most of you I'm sure can't read Hindi, but you can figure out what it is. We began to think afresh about what would help children learn to read. Reading is key to the next level of everything, whether it's math or language, and therefore there was a big focus on reading. And we basically developed this kind of very simple tool to just understand our own children, the children that we were going to teach. So if a child can't read letters, what do I need to do to get him up to words? Child can read words, what do we need to do to move him up to sentences? It was just very simple. So it was really meant for us to really clarify and specify our instructional design. But in doing it, we noticed that a lot of other people got involved. So if you're working on this in the community, you found that parents often came and wanted to know exactly what was going on. We found this was quite useful to teachers as well. Even though teachers have been to teacher training college, they hadn't actually come across something as simple as this. And so this tool, which was really to design action, we began to see that it could be used for assessment on a very wide scale because it was quite simple and it was easy for people to interpret what they were doing. So for example, for a class, all you did was to create a grid like this, and during the course of a class, as you can see, the teacher would listen, whether the teacher was a community instructor or a regular government school teacher. You just sat with children one-on-one, noted down where they were, and therefore you had a sense of what is the ability distribution in your own class and what do you need to push children upwards. Some people had classes where everybody was in the lower left-hand corner. Some people had classes like this one where the distribution is. If you were an illiterate mother and you were the mother of, let's say, Ron, you could come and ask, why is my son not moving and everybody else is moving? So we found that this tool and this grid was a very useful way both of looking at individual children as well as of the group that's moving up. A second example is of these village report cards. This is a description of what Rachel went through, what we would call the intervention 3. Where we feel that to get the whole village on board, you first have a small discussion in each hamlet, use the tool so that people can figure out where their children are at, simultaneously run a demonstration class in the village for 4 or 5 days, where there's actually somebody showing you that children can make a big jump in a short period of time. Then you have a big village meeting where you discuss this, discuss and what steps can be done next, and then track the changes in children's learning, especially in the volunteer-based classes that are going on. So this was a process that we used both in the study as well as we've used in different forms otherwise. From these efforts to understand what people what people gather, what propels action, this is a kind of a attempt to create I don't know what to call it, create a chart. And it has helped us a lot. I want to give you an example of a village in UP, which is one of our backward states, where we started this process that I've just described to you. And it's customary to first go to the village headman to say, I'm going to do this. And I remember going to this man, and he said, yeah, go ahead. There's lots of surveys in the village. You're another one. Feel free. Carry on. About 4 or 5 days later, we came back with the whole village report card. And we wanted to invite him to the village meeting. So I went up to him and I said, I'd like to tell you what happened, what your village report card looks like. And the man said to me, just show me where I should sign. So I said, well, actually there's no place on it to sign. So he was very puzzled because he said, data is usually collected to send somewhere. So what do you mean there's nowhere to sign? So I said, actually, he then requested me to ask my superiors, what I was supposed to do with it. Maybe I was not well trained as a field surveyor and didn't know what to do with the data. So at that point I said, actually, I am the superior. Well, that was even worse. Because if you are the superior, why are you collecting data yourself? You clearly come from an organization that has no resources. I didn't even come in a car. I mean, what sort of a superior could you be? Then he began to pay a little more attention, and he said, clearly, figures are false. So why would that be? Because figures are false. Don't you know? All data that is collected, it starts with good intention, but he had a big village. There was 300 households. And nobody has the patience actually to go from household to household, and therefore all data ends up false. So this data is false. So we made very polite attempts to say, well, actually it's not false. Here are the people who collected it. Here is the people from every hamlet. And then he said, okay, so what does this actually say? Meanwhile, it's been almost an hour in this discussion. So I said, well, the data says, I don't remember exactly, but there are, let's say, 400 children, 370 go to school, and less than 200 or 175 can read. At that point, this village headman, who thought of himself as a very progressive guy, says, that can't be. It's not false. It just can't be. Because if you go to school, how is it that you can't read? And I have to tell you, this is the reaction that we have from the village headman all the way to the top of our government. We had exactly the same reaction from the person who heads our planning commission, who said exactly this. We are spending millions and millions of rupees on schooling. How is it that they haven't learned how to read? And much of what I've put down here actually comes from that if you don't have the curiosity to find out, no matter how much data there is, you're not convinced. One of the only ways, I think, to really get participation is to have simple enough things that you do yourself that convinces you that this whole aggregate is probably okay. So in our case, my village headman then said, oh my God, if what you're saying is true, I have to check it out for myself. So we walked down the village with the simple tool. It wasn't very randomized. He just called whoever he could find. And after the 10th child, he just hung his head and said, I am shamed by this because I thought I knew my village quite well. So with your own data, it's very hard to run away. As Indians, I have not much experience of other countries, but we already know everything there is to know. Sometimes I wonder why we need the right to information, because we know it already. And it's usually based on your grandchildren, your neighbors' children, and other such compelling anecdotes, which propel you to do whatever you want to do next. And therefore, how do you move from this anecdote to this aggregate? We found that even the village was too big. You kind of needed to go hamlet by hamlet, where you actually know everybody there. And once you've seen the aggregate, then you can begin to analyze to say what needs to be done. The third step was, what can you do? Because again, it may be a very Indian thing, but you blame everybody else. You start with the British. They left like 60 years ago, but surely they created all the nonsense that we have. Then you blame the politicians, you blame everybody. The only person you don't blame is you. And eventually, when you don't find anybody else, you blame the children. But the blame is somewhere else. The blame is not with you. So this shift, and I think you see this kind of thread through many of the presentations. How do you take ownership of the problem? And only then you can make the solutions. So what as citizens can we do? And what are the strategies? And this little volunteers running their own class is an important step to say, I am part of this village. I can read. I'm going to teach some more children to read. And that seems to be a very important, a little step, but an important step to get everybody to think about, okay, this is what we can do, and now what can the government provide us with? So this is, in a sense, I think our different studies are testing these. Rachel had a different set of arrows and a different set of boxes, but I think that this is what we are trying to test to see which of these would work to make us move forward as a country. Just a big leap from the kind of village stuff. Obviously, various things happen in between, but we decided if we want to bring some of these key ideas up to the national level, what will you do? And since 2005, we've been carrying out this exercise, which is called the Annual Status of Education Report. The acronym is ASAR, which in Hindi means impact. And last night over dinner, we were talking about somebody, friend of Dean's, I think, or Abhijit's, who runs 100 miles very easily. And I couldn't understand why anybody would want to do that. And Abhijit said, well, you're crazy as well, because you do this. So this is like running 100 miles in the bush or hill or wherever it is that people run these things. That when we thought about it, it was a ridiculous thing to do. It's a big country. We have 600 districts. And what we wanted to do was a version of that intervention 3, maybe without the action, to really get assessments and estimates of learning for the whole country. We also didn't have any money to do it because this was not part of any annual plan. And I forgot to tell JPAL that there is no free lunch. So after this, we're going to pass around a hat for our next survey. Basically, what it is that we test children at home. We use very similar tools. And in every district, there is a sampling design done by some well-trained statistician. Because in India, again, nobody knows anything about sampling, but everybody has a view. So from the village headman till the Prime Minister of India, maybe the Prime Minister of India knows sampling, but very few people, other people do. And as soon as they don't like results, they say, oh, your sampling is wrong. But if you ask what is right sampling, nobody has the right answer. So it's very important for this kind of exercise, especially if it's a people's exercise, because on the one hand, you want people and you want to give power to the people, but if the people come back with something you don't like, then you don't think people are good enough to do anything. So it's very important to have good statisticians. And we have these tools. It's basically a floor test. It's done every year in October and November, and the report comes out in January. So it's a very, kind of high-speed assessment. And it comes out, I forgot to bring it, but we have like a one-page which outlines the results, which I will just show you. This is basically the reading report card of rural India of last year, which tells you that in 5th grade, it tells you many things, but basically it tells you that in 5th grade, there is about 56% of children who can read the longest version of the tool that I showed you, which means that close to little more than 40% children have reached 5th grade, 5 years of schooling, and are not able to do something that we expect children to do in the beginning of 2nd grade. In India, you are promoted through 5th grade to the end of your primary stage. There is no holding back, there is no failing children. But in 6th grade, you can be sure that 45% of children will fall out because they can't cope with what is in the 6th grade curriculum, and you cannot be automatically promoted as you go ahead. So this, if we had to say one thing, every year for every district in the country, this is the report. There's one for math as well that comes out. This is just an extrapolation of that. We look from 2006 to 2008, and this is a graph which just gives you the percentage of children who can read what we call a grade 2 level text. And at the bottom we have grades 3, 4, 5, 6. And the lines are more or less unchanged. I mean, there's some slight movement, but not a lot. Now, if you wanted as a country to move this graph up every year, then what is it that we need to do, state after state, district after district? If you have a goal which says 2010, where can you be in 2010? There are some states which have made good progress, but this is the kind of thing that we feel that the evidence needs to be looked at the country level, at the state level, to plan the next few years so that we don't lose millions of children despite investing in them and in their elementary education. So now quickly to what about action? And you'll see that our evolution of the big program we run right now, which is called Read India, you can see kind of the way we have progressed. In around 2000 and so on, we were really practicing, we as in all full-time Pratham people, were practicing themselves with children. And at that point, we had anywhere between 170 to 200,000 children. The lower box tells you that that was a study that JPAL did with us, which actually looked at what we were able to achieve. The next study is what Rachel described. We moved to rural areas and we began to experiment with how do we catalyze village communities to actually participate. And the big focus there was on this whole village volunteer, unpaid village volunteer, and what value they can add. And finally, we are in this red box, which I'll go through for a little bit. And I see Adrian is here. So one of the participants of the latest study is also here. We were then ready kind of to go across the country, not because we were particularly capable, but because we felt it really needed to be done. Esther provided us from 2005 numbers and figures and estimates for the whole country. So even if you couldn't act, you could take it to the relevant authorities. We have a planning system at the district level and present this information continuously at all levels. In the study that Rachel presented, we were acting at the village level. All our action was at the village level. We learned from the study that maybe you need to push at all levels repeatedly with information that is easily digestible. And so really, after 2006 ASAR results were out, we formally declared Read India and began to reach out through partners and through governments to as many states and as many children as possible. So how do you actually, before getting into how the study was designed, we decided based on our own experiences as well as on the evidence that came through that you need to work simultaneously both on villages as well as on school systems. And here are some of the details. Basically, somebody needs to allocate time to work with children who've fallen behind. You need to give children some additional reading material. The person who will work with the children, whether it's a school teacher or a community volunteer, needs some amount of training, some amount of support in terms of academic support. And you also need to kind of assess how far this is going and how well. Now the challenge was, in the current study that we're doing with JPAL, that how do you evaluate something like this? And I'm sure these are challenges that a lot of you face. It's a very large-scale program. It covers half of India. It covers 15 different states which have different languages and different structures. Within our own Read India framework, we have a framework, but Pratham is quite decentralized. So each state kind of spawns their own version of what it is. So if you had to pick a representative state, I don't think there is one, because every state has its own characteristics of both the school system, both the sort of the context, the social context, as well as how we have chosen to operate. We have multiple partners. In my own home state of Bihar, in the Read India program, there is the government, there is UNICEF, there is another organization, and there is us. It's a massive partnership of people at the block level. So a block in India has about 100 villages, and there are 4 different partners in joint teams working on this. So when you design, and we love randomized evaluation, but a lot of people within this partnership are highly confused as to why this is being done like this. These agencies, and especially if you have evaluations that are going to run for a year or 2 or 3, these partnerships have to remain stable for this period of time, and everybody has to buy in. With governments as well, we deal with many state governments, and we've learned that as soon as you sign a memorandum of understanding with the government, it will fall through. Very often when we don't have formal memorandums of understanding, the relationship stays stable. Again, maybe this is a particularly Indian thing that we have some great aversion to formality or something, but there are variations in government partnerships from school year to school year. So if you're going to design a multi-year study, when you do it in the community, it's in your control. But when you do it with governments, there are other unpredictable partners. And finally, there is a need for speed. There is a real time and there is a research time. And to really digest what is being produced by the data collection takes time. But often decisions need to be taken much faster than perhaps. But anyway, here's the design of the evaluation. We are working in something like 3,000 blocks across India. Blocks have 100 villages. But the study, given what we need to do, can only be in about 6 blocks. It's a 2-year study. We're studying 2 or 3 interventions, slight modifications in each stage. And we are just through with sort of the first year of the study, moving into the second year. And here are the kinds of interventions. There's not only challenges, because we've learned over the years of working with JPAL that the actual process of doing the evaluation generates huge amounts of learning. And I think perhaps as academics, people focus on the findings, whereas we find actually the process extremely enriching and a lot of stuff that comes out of that. So for us, there are opportunities, and in a way, how to invest well in an evaluation to learn the most out of it while the evaluation is in process, I think presents the biggest opportunity. And especially, I think somebody raised this yesterday. All our projects with JPAL have been designed jointly. Not a single evaluation has been forced on us. If anything, I think we force ourselves and JPAL to say, what's the next thing that we will do together, because of the learning opportunities for practitioners like us that comes out because of the jointness. I'll stop here because I know we're only slightly over time. But again, just coming back, in this knowledge against poverty, just some numbers will help to bring us down to earth. We have 200 million kids in the age group, school-going age group. Very, very high proportion are enrolled in school. And as I said, after 5 years of being in school, 50% yet cannot read at a very basic level. So very rapid and urgent action is needed on massive scale. And without this, I think this MDG goal of universal enrollment, I mean, MDG may have some goals for countries like India, but India needs to have far higher goals if we're really going to make this education business really meaningful.